Hey, reader. This is Centaur, and welcome back to the channel. We've got a new video we're going to be doing today talking about light mortars and whether or not they are good or bad or whatever. I don't think they're particularly ugly, so we're not going to even consider that in today's thing. I think, actually, all things considered, pretty elegant design, so we're just not even going to touch that. I think in general, though, this is one of the things you will see debated in the Facebook groups relatively often. Newer players, older players, there seems to be something of a divide as to whether or not mortars, especially the light mortar variety, is worth taking. I'll be honest, I have definite and strong thoughts on this. I don't tend to be particularly positive on light mortars, and we're going to talk about why. Okay. But the first thing we're gonna look at as we're talking about this, or I'm going to back up a little bit on the slideshow. We're going to start by talking about second edition, and then we're going to talk about light mortars in third edition because there were some changes. I think on the whole, pretty good changes. Just small, tiny tweaks that do have a pretty dramatic difference in terms of how they play. That being said, I'm just going to tell you right now. In second edition, I didn't really like them. In third edition, I don't particularly like them because while I think some of the problems that they had in second edition were fixed, the overall rule changes in third edition create negatives that are difficult to get over and get past. So anyway, but we'll talk about third edition afterwards within the context of our discussion of second edition. And then after doing that, we're going to talk a little bit about, hey, if you like them, great. You totally can. I don't have a problem with that at all. So here's some thoughts on maybe some ways to optimize and economize to get the most value out of it. So that way, even if you're a casual player who's recreating, say, a Royal Commandos unit, and as far as I know, I don't think they used mortars larger than a 60 millimeter mortar, then great, go ahead and use them, and maybe this is how you can get a little more value out of them. And then at the end, I'm going to mention just like a few tweaks that I would personally make to both second and third edition. It's pretty system agnostic as to which ones, where you apply them to. The things that might make it so that they are more of an appealing choice by comparison to other options that are available. So first of all, let's talk a little bit about what we mean when we talk about light mortars and kind of by extension, uh, the VB launcher, which is kind of like a specialized grenade launcher rifle attachment. It's a rifle grenade of sorts that you can get with some armies. Mostly it's like the Greeks, the Belgians, the French. It's basically early war subset of the Allies who bought French equipment that get it out of there. Okay. And so the things we're going to talk about, just so you can kind of see it there, we're going to look at the team weapons, obviously, because you have 2-man and 3-man teams that use light mortars. We're also going to look at it as a squad-based weapon because I think the math changes a bit and the utility changes a bit, whether it's in a squad with a lot of bodies that can keep it alive longer, but also maybe has more duties that it needs to perform. So they do feel different when fielded in those forms. We're also going to, after looking at second edition and third edition assessments, I kind of wanted to give you upfront a look at the specific things we're going to be weighing. We are going to look at range. We're going to look at damage capability. We're going to look at pins, squad size, the cost, and whether or not it's just a cheap order dice and how useful that is. Using them to maybe upgun transports, because that's another thing that you'll sometimes see recommended. It's a great way to get a little bit of extra value out of a Bren carrier or an M3 half track, right, or something like that. Talk about them for objective camping, which I think is probably what most people rely on them on. As well as the opportunity costs that come by running a light mortar as opposed to running something else. Okay. So to start off with, I think the range is bad in second edition. At 12 to 24 inches, asterisk, because we'll come back to that in a little bit, or 6 to 18 inches in the case of a VB launcher, the range is just too short for what the weapon is designed to do. At 24 inches or less, almost anything in the game can shoot at you if you can shoot at it. And when you are a 2-man, most commonly run inexperienced light mortar team that cannot use a spotter in second edition, that's problematic because it does two problems for you. The first is that you're hitting at the same range as somebody else. If they're shooting at you and you're shooting at them, there's a decent chance you're going to be removed first. Even if you get lucky, roll a 6 on your first range in, and then you're ranging in on 2s after that. The second issue is that it's a free measurement for your opponent, right? If you measure and you're just outside 24 inches, or you're just within 24 inches, and the opponent has a rifle, your opponent now knows they can stay right where they are and shoot at you in return fire because they now know the distance, right? Whereas if you have, say, a 60-inch medium mortar, you throw it down there and you say, see, clearly I'm in range. It's a little harder to quickly assess, okay, so what's the difference? And, they're shooting over certain things because they're using a spotter. So, like, how far do I need to move in order to get in range of them? It's a little more difficult to gauge that. Whereas with a light mortar and a VB launcher, because you got to fire direct, you're basically giving a free measurement to your opponent. And all they have to do is remember they're in range of me, so I'm in range of them, and they can shoot back at you. This also creates an issue, though, when it isn't just rifles, because 24 is a very specific number. Because of the fact that you have to be within 12 to 24, even a unit with a submachine gun that only fires at 12 inches, as long as they see, oh, well, I'm not at like 18 inches away from them, I'm like 16 inches away from them, they're also getting a free measurement because now they know, oh, I'm just going to move up and then I'm going to start shooting. And that's going to at least force them to fall back because they can't shoot back at me now. All they'll be doing is going down, right? Because I'm now within their minimum range. So it's even a free measurement to things like submachine guns, which is another relatively common loadout that you'll see on the battlefield. There is an asterisk next to the ranges, though, and that's because, technically speaking, this is the only mortar that can move and shoot on the same turn. Doesn't have the fixed property, which means you could advance on an advance action or tactically withdraw, which is probably more common on an advance action, and move backwards 6 inches, and then fire, which is a relatively effective way for an infantry squad to be able to keep that 12-inch minimum range, make it maybe a little less dangerous, because at least you can scoot away a bit and increase that minimum range to maybe still keep an opponent in range. It's still not the greatest thing because it's not that far. Everybody else in the game is still moving faster than you, unless it's a Renault FT, I guess. That technically can't move faster than 6 inches. But at the same time, you're also resetting your ranging in because per the rules, and this doesn't change going into 3rd edition, if you take an action that isn't the fire action, you reset your ranging in. So like on the one hand, it does mean you have the ability to redeploy. On the other hand, you're not as likely to do damage on subsequent turns. So like, it's not horrible. It is useful. It has its tactical benefits. Probably the biggest issue though with light mortars when it comes to their range is that you cannot use a spotter. Because in 2nd edition, spotters only work for the specific unit that takes them, and light mortars aren't allowed to take a spotter. Which presents a problem, because again, it means you have to fire direct. And that means you're firing down a lane, and even if your opponent would, have to go through cover or have to go through, some form of rough terrain in order to get to you, cross a river, right, or something like that, they can still get to you, and that could be problematic. So from a range perspective, the fact that it's so short, and it's primarily useful against things that would have a longer range that kind of want to just sit and camp, like say a machine gun team or a sniper team or another mortar team or artillery piece, the range is just too short to be highly effective against those kinds of targets. If you were to outflank, maybe it'd be a little more useful. Outflanking with primarily inexperienced light mortar teams, which is mostly how people run them, it's probably not advised unless you're one of those cool armies that gets a benefit where you don't suffer the outflanking penalty. But in general, because of that, the range does become an issue in 2nd edition. And the writers, by the way, recognize this, as we'll see when we get to 3rd. Damage is also a bit of an issue. The first problem is you don't get to roll damage very often in general using law of averages for a light mortar, right? You have to range in. The way ranging in works, in case you're new to bolt action, is that on your first turn when you shoot at something, you roll a dice, 6-sided dice, and you're looking for a 6. If by the start of the next turn, when you activate your light mortar, whenever that is in the turn sequence, if you have not taken another action, so you haven't gone down, you haven't been forced down by some other effect, if your opponent hasn't moved, more than X number of inches away from where they were before, then when you roll the dice, you'll hit on a 5 or a 6 because you've told them to change the angle of fire, and you've been able to kind of reset it and range it in a little bit more accurately. And so on and so forth until eventually you do hit. And when you do hit, then from that point on, assuming again that they haven't moved, you haven't moved or done anything else, then you always hit on a 2+. And that's the sweet spot, right? That's where indirect fire units really shine. But realize that on average, this means you're probably going to range in, within the first 2 to 3 turns. And then assuming you still get to fire, you may get to hit another turn or two. And this assumes, of course, that the other unit hasn't been destroyed by other means in the process, or that you don't wipe it out with the light mortar in the case of a smaller team of people. The result is you don't actually hit that often in a given game. I like to tell people plan on like 1 to 3 times, more or less, is kind of the number of times you'd expect to hit with a light mortar. Could potentially be less than that. It all depends. The second issue is that when you do roll for damage, you have a high explosive or HE value of 1 inch, which means you'd put a 1-inch template down, and then you would hit all the targets whose spaces you overlap. You have to place it like between units or on top of one of the units within the squad. You get a +1 to wound, which is fine if you're hitting like inexperienced troops because you're wounding on 2s, which means even if you're only getting 1 to 3 hits out of it, you're actually probably removing most of them, which is not bad. But as soon as you start hitting regular and veteran troops, which is most troops, by the way, that you're going to see on the battlefield, you're wounding them on 3s and 4s, which means if you're only hitting 1 to 2 guys, which is the most common number that you're going to hit, you're wounding maybe one of them, maybe. And even if you hit a building, you're only doing D2 hits against the building. So it's only going to be 1 or 2 dudes, again, wounding on like 2s, 3s, 4s, or something like that. So you're not going to do much. And then against any sort of vehicle, you're really not going to do much because you're looking for like 5s or worse. And sometimes you can't even do damage at all, right? So, the damage total that you're going to get is probably not that high. Now, you do get the benefit over and against, say, a heavy machine gun, that you don't suffer that -1 to your penetration for being at long range, which is good because your long range is your range for a light mortar, right? You have a maximum range of 24, but a minimum range of 12. So, all of your range would technically be your long range, right? But you don't suffer penalty. So that's a positive. That's a good thing. See, I'm trying to be fair. But the result is your ceiling is probably going to be like 1 to 4 hits. 4 if they're like really tightly bunched together and you've got guys really, really tight. You could place the template in between all of them and overlap a portion of all 4 of their bases. But most likely, again, it's going to be like 2, okay? Likely wounds is going to be about 0 to 1. In 2nd edition, there's no cover save. So once you do your damage, you've done your damage, and that's good. But that's the most common situation that you're going to see is probably going to be that. But the result is you don't really recoup your points, assuming you run it 24 to 34 to 35 points, like most people did in 2nd edition. You're going to have to do like 2 to 3 wounds, possibly more, in order to get your points back. So purely from a points recovered or balanced perspective, damage is not very good. Pins are also an issue. Okay, a lot of people buy high explosive or HE weapons because of their pin generation capability. Maybe they do damage, maybe they don't. The big thing is if we can force the enemy to go down, if we can force them to rally, it's basically like they aren't on the table for a turn, right? Which is kind of like removing them to some extent. And that's useful, right? Sometimes just keeping guys down so they're not removing your guys is worthwhile. Light mortars do D2 pins whenever they hit. So you roll a D6 on a 4+, you do 2 pins. On a 3 or lower, you do 1 pin. A lot of people online are going to say that light mortars do 2 pins every turn. And I just want to put it on the record because I have to say it quite a bit on Facebook. D2 pins does not equal 2. Okay? You have a 50% chance of getting 2, which is kind of like the chance of wounding a regular soldier. Sometimes you wound them, sometimes you don't, right? And so your likely number of pins each game is actually probably closer to like 2 to 4. And this assumes 6 to 7 turns with the mortar surviving for all of those turns. And it's shooting every turn. It isn't having to reset. It isn't having to go down. It isn't running so that it can get to an objective. This assumes consistent firing. You aren't actually likely to do more than 2 to 4 pins per game, just in terms of law of averages. Okay. Now, somebody is going to say, but Centaur, if it's based in a squad instead of being its own small team weapon, then I can split fire, which is true. So your rifles, for example, or your submachine guns or whatever it is that you've thrown into the squad can fire in one direction at one target that it can see. And then your light mortar or your VB launcher or whatever can shoot at another unit that it can see. And you can split them. And that means I could potentially do a pin to a unit over here and 1 to 2 pins to a unit over there. And that is pretty effective, right? Kind of. In order to explain this, we're going to take a quick jump to the battle board because I think this is going to be useful just for helping you to kind of think through some of what we've just been talking about, from range to damage, but also to how pin generation actually works and whether or not it would actually make a difference on the battlefield because of the fact that we split fire. Okay, and then afterwards, once we get back from the battle board, we'll talk about points and effectiveness and stuff like that. Okay, switching camera and also switching my microphone, so hopefully this works out okay. So this is part of a game that I played. It's not the entirety of the map because obviously we kept playing through it and then we came back to reset this in order to kind of show you the options here. So our target unit for our practice and our what do you think is going to happen and what do you prioritize is this light mortar team. It's Japanese light mortar team, basically one of the few light mortars that I actually own because I pretty much only have them right now for Belgium and Japan on account of I wanted to try out that whole grenadier thing. Maybe I'll build them for other nations later. Time will tell. But in this case, the thought exercise is that there are 3 units that are potential options. They might potentially be in range, and they might also be a potential threat that you can actually remove with a light mortar. Okay, the first option is a 2-man officer team here. These guys are regulars. They both carry submachine guns. So the closer they get to this unit, the more in danger they are. And it only has 2 models in it. So maybe this is a really, really good option because of the fact that there's only 2 of them. So if you hit them and you do damage to both of them, then you might actually remove an entire unit. The second unit is a 7-man infantry section over here. It has 1 Browning automatic rifle, this guy right here, and 6 regular rifles, which was a fine build in 2nd edition. I probably would have taken a 2nd BAR in there. In 3rd edition, I think it's also a very good build because you can maximize on your army special rule. They are, without pre-measuring it, they look pretty close, right? That could be 12 inches. It may not be from the light mortar team, but they definitely present the most threat to this light mortar team because if they even come close and start shooting at them, there's a very good chance that they're going to remove somebody and that could cause a morale check. So that's your second option. And your third option is that way back here, there is a medium mortar team. They're currently hanging out in the forest. We're considering that to be entire forested terrain, that whole footprint. They technically do have a spotter if I don't make you all seasick, because again, I don't own a GoPro. Their spotter is just kind of hanging out on this hill, so that way they can get nice, good visibility to the other side of the map, take advantage of that medium mortar. And the mortar has currently not been ranging in on the light mortar team. It has other more important things to do. So technically, if the light mortar were to start shooting at it, it would have the jump in terms of ranging in. Okay? So your question is, as a light mortar team, thought experiment, what do you target? Now, in this case, we don't have them, camping an objective. This was a relatively straightforward, dawn assault sort of mission where you're just trying to remove enemy units. So on the one hand, just looking at it, eyeballing it, this looks to be more than 12 inches to me. So I would be inclined to potentially consider that attack. This one seems to be the most danger to the light mortar. So there would be a side of me that would want to potentially attack that unit. And this unit isn't likely to move. So I'm most likely to range in on that unit. Okay, now, if this was a pre-measuring game, we could measure out to each of these, see if any of them are in our minimum range, and thus which shots would automatically miss. It is not a pre-measuring game. I think personally that's very good. I think it helps us to make faster and snappier decisions, and it skips a whole phase of the game, which is the geometry phase. But in this case, just purely looking at it, my first reaction, because I believe you are allowed to do this, is to check line of sight to see which units you can actually see. So if we drop down over here, obviously, We can see the rifle squad over there in the back. If my camera will zoom in nicely, there we go. So they are definitely an eligible target. And even dropping down to here, you can see the medium mortar team over this trench. If it was flat with the ground, maybe you would, maybe you wouldn't. But you can in fact see them, so that is an eligible target. And then this is where things get interesting. So over here we have the officer section. And this guy, the guy actually carrying the weapon, actually cannot see them because he's shorter than the barrier he's behind. And this guy who's poking out actually also cannot see them because the section where he would be able to see them probably is being blocked by the hill itself. So that unit, interestingly enough, and this is one of the issues that I have with light mortar teams as sculpted, is that they are often in a prone or kneeling manner because that's how the weapon is actually fired on account of its low profile. But that means that there are some obstacles that normal infantry, like these guys, would be able to see over, but a light mortar team cannot. And so even though this unit, I'm going to go out on a limb and say that they are in fact outside of the minimum range. If we measure out to the minimum range, 12 inches, they are outside of it. They are technically within the range of the weapon, but they can't shoot at them because they don't have line of sight. Okay? Now this unit over here represents the most threat. I would be tempted to shoot at this unit, but as I mentioned, I think it looks pretty close. So let's just put down the tape measure and let's see how close they are. They are within that 12-inch minimum range, which means even though it's only part of one guy, if we were to declare that shot to try to shoot at them before they can try to assault us, automatic miss. And what's more, adding insult to injury about this whole 12-inch minimum range thing that mortars have, if I declare this shot, it turns out that they're within that 12 inches and I automatically miss. That also tells this guy, especially since he doesn't have to cross a barrier in order to get to me, that if he declares an assault, he's in range. That's a free measurement that I've now given to my opponent because he can tell, hey, I'm in the minimum range. That means that I'm within assault range. So the best option I would anticipate would be to shoot at this unit. And I think it's within the maximum range. This is where it gets tricky. Measure out to the 24. It looks like we are just barely clipping the base. I am just on top of those bushes on the base. So it is exactly 24 and a smidge inches away. So for the purpose of the thought experiment, if you said I would shoot at this unit, wouldn't have line of sight, shot wouldn't hit. Shot auto misses. If we shoot at this unit, they are too close. Shot automatically misses. We don't hit them either. If we shoot at this unit, we start ranging in, looking for sixes. Okay? Now again, obviously there's going to be more units on the battlefield. There'll be other things looking into it. But this, I think, is helpful for figuring out the limitations of the light mortar team. It is a unit that has a place, but there are, because of the fact it has that 24-inch maximum range in second edition, it is very, very easy to encroach on it and make it so that even if there is an ideal target that it can work on, it may not be able to actually work on that target. And while, yes, a light mortar against a medium mortar is also actually a pretty good matchup, because if you hit it, you're probably going to be doing some wounds in there, since people don't tend to take mortar teams at veteran. I mean, it's going to take a while, and do we think we're going to hit and do wounds to this unit before this unit polishes us off, or this unit moves out so that they can see us and start shooting at us with submachine guns? I don't know. I mean, that's it's dicey, right, to say the least, as to whether or not we'll even make it to the end target. So, okay. So now that we've talked about splitting weapons and splitting fire and stuff like that, like, yes, you do want to, as you can notice, there are things to think about, right? It's not just so simple as, oh, well, I have the ability to shoot at 2 units, therefore I will be able to shoot at 2 units, right? Both units have to be in line of sight. So the position of your mortarman, whether he's kneeling or prone or something like that, does matter. Because if he's behind a wall or behind a very, very high trench line or something like that, he might not have visibility to the unit he wants to see. You need to plan accordingly for how you space out the unit, how you deploy them out, where you position them. This does matter. So keep that in mind, okay? It also means they can't be within your minimum range, so you want to make sure that they don't get into your minimum range. And then finally, you need to shoot at them. So, insert the commentary from the hit chance, only relying on ranging in, and then you're generating pins, and you're only generating D2 pins. Splitting fire can get you more hits, and thus it can get you more pins. However, because of the cost of light mortar weapons in a squad, the fact that you're paying like 25 points per light mortar in second edition means that if you're taking a grenadier section with 3, which I think if you're in for a penny, you should be in for a pound. Okay, like if you're going to take 1 in a squad, take 2, take 3. Right? VB launchers, you only get access to 1, but if you're taking light mortars in a squad, you should at least be taking 2, if not 3. Okay, because you need it to work sometimes. You're putting so many points in one unit on the battlefield that could potentially be hit with a howitzer. You better make it worthwhile. But if you're putting 2 or 3 into a squad, you could get yourself another rifle squad. And if only roughly 1 of those light mortars is hitting every turn and it's only doing 1 to 2 pins, maybe it's more worthwhile to take a second squad that shoots with rifles and also does that second pin, but also gives you an extra order dice and a lot more bodies and potentially another unit that can contest objectives. Like there's just a lot more that I think you can get. And this is why when I build lists that have grenadier section options available, I don't tend to find myself with the points lying around to take these light mortars, because it does add up as you're going and adding them in. The other issue that comes into play, and this is true for any unit that isn't doing 2 or more reliably, 2 or more pins reliably, is the notion of pin shedding. So pin shedding is where you shoot at a unit, you apply pins to it, and you apply like 1 pin to it. And then when it activates, it passes an order test and it removes that pin. So now when it takes its turn and it activates, it's activating as if it hadn't been pinned, aka the unit that hit it didn't do anything. Now, obviously in second edition, this is slightly more useful because if people are running regulars and they need an 8 or higher after, an 8 or lower after they've suffered their pin for passing their order test, there's a decent chance they're not going to pass, right? Officers can't be everywhere. In third edition, we're going to find pin shedding becomes dramatically easier because morale bubbles become more numerous, okay? But in second edition, pin shedding was a serious, could still be a very serious issue, because it meant if the light mortar wasn't firing at something to apply a pin, splitting fire or part of a team weapon, doesn't matter. If something else wasn't also firing at that unit before it activated, it might just act normally, right? The light mortar added a little bit of hassle, a little bit of an order test, but if they pass, and most units would pass over 50% of the time, it wasn't actually going to make a difference, okay? So unlike, say, a medium or a heavy mortar, which is giving D3 pins, so on average it's doing 2, and it's just as likely to do 3 as it is to do 1, light mortars, which filled the same spot, just were not nearly as reliable for pin generation. And the amount of points you saved in order to get the light mortar over and against a medium or heavy mortar was not dramatic, okay? Now this brings us to unit size in second edition. If it was taken as a team weapon, it was taken either as a 2-man team or a 3-man team. There were a couple of nations, Poland, United States, if you weren't running an airborne light mortar team, they could take them as 3-man units instead of 2-man units. Now, on the one hand, more men means more bodies, which means your opponent can do more wounds without fully removing the unit. On the other hand, it meant that you lose the small team special rule, which means you are easier to hit. The small team special rule in second edition was just a flat -1 to hit against the unit because they're tiny, right? There's not a lot of margin for error for where you're shooting at. So in my opinion, a 3-man team was a trap. It was the same cost to take a 3-man light mortar team as it was to take a 3-man medium mortar team. And if I'm going to pay the same amount for the same number of guys, but I'm going to get a dramatically better weapon. I'm going to take the medium mortar every single time. So toward that end, I wouldn't recommend the 3-man light mortar teams, and I don't think anybody else would either. I suspect that if we were talking about it casually among friends, nobody's going to sit there and stump for the 3-man light mortar team in second edition. Okay. On the other hand, the trade-off to having a 3-man light mortar team, and this is important to note, is you were less likely to have to take morale tests for losing half or more of the unit in a single shot. And so light mortar teams as a 2-man team, while they are harder to hit, any hit that happens to them is going to matter a lot because you're probably taking them inexperienced, possibly regular, but probably not veteran. Very rare to see those outside of like a person who's reenacting, a group of airborne units or Royal Commandos or something like that, where they just want everybody to be veteran. Most likely they're being run inexperienced or regular for reasons we're going to talk about later when we talk about point costs and opportunity cost. But if that's the case, if even one wound sneaks through, you could potentially be rolling dice to see if the other guy runs too, right? One wound could potentially and effectively be 2. And slightly harder with a 3-man team. So that would be like the one argument in favor of it. I don't find it to be particularly compelling, but that would be the reason why. Points costs. Let's talk a little bit about what point costs actually are. So the teams and the squads, interestingly enough, have different costs for the weapons. Okay. If you buy a 24-point inexperienced light mortar team, you are paying 14 points for the 2 inexperienced men that are manning it. And the remainder of that 24, which is 10 points, is the cost of the actual light mortar heavy weapon. And if you look at the cost for it, the light mortar costs 10, 15, or 20 points based on whether you take it in a team, inexperienced, regular, or veteran, respectively. But in a squad, the light mortar costs 25 points. On its own just kind of feels a little bit weird, okay? And so in recommended changes, sure enough, we're going to talk about this. I find that to just be really weird because it's the same weapon. It's not like you get added benefits. Sure, it's a little more survivable, but it's still the same weapon, right? I don't know why it would cost sometimes double or more what the other same item, the same piece of physical hardware would, okay? A VB launcher is only a squad-based weapon, and it costs 20 points. Not horrible. Works out. A medium mortar as part of a team weapon, just so we're all on the same page, you're paying, for 35 points, you get 3 men and a medium mortar. So you're paying 21 points in experience for the men and 14 points for the medium mortar. Or 20 points if it's regular, or 26 points if it's veteran. Now note, that is only 4 to 6 points more than what a light mortar team weapon does. But by comparison, and this is, I think, why the medium mortar was dramatically more useful, you're getting a lot more gun out of that, right? I mean, you're getting a maximum range of 60 inches instead of 24, and you still have the same minimum range of 12. You're getting a pen plus 2 instead of a pen plus 1 because you're doing a 2-inch template instead of a 1-inch template. You're getting 4 times-ish, asterisk, the surface area for your hit, which is not 4 times the amount of wounds, but it is easily double the number that you can expect. And it can take a spotter. So even though you can make it cost more, you can also hide it, so it's more likely to survive, and it can still be quite effective. It also fills more roles, which we'll talk about later when we talk about opportunity cost. But the point being, I think the reason why in second edition we saw so many people more drawn to medium mortars is that, one, they did come in starter armies. We need to be honest about that. That's part of it. Part of it is access, okay? You don't have to buy a completely separate support team in order to get it. Flip side, of course, a number of infantry sprues come with light mortars on them, so it's not like people were exactly hurting for getting access to light mortars. However, in general, I think a lot of people, it was a combination of easy access, the unit performs really well, stats look really good. And I think people played against a medium mortar once, and after playing against it, they were like, dang, that thing really works. I think I'm going to try one of those out. Oh, look, I have one in my collection. I'm going to try fielding it. So I think in general, from a points cost perspective, yes, technically a light mortar costs less than a medium mortar, but not by that much. And I think the margin in general, it more than made up for itself. Now, some people are going to say, well, the cost for the weapon and such isn't really what's important. What's important is that it's a cheap order dice, right? So the thinking is that if I have more order dice in the order dice pool, there's more chance my dice are going to be drawn, which means there's more chances I can put pins down range or remove enemy threats or save a unit that needs to be saved or things like that. And thus, by extension, even if the light mortar is only in there to contribute its dice, it's doing its job. And on the whole, this is a good point. Okay, having order dice does help. I've played in tournaments where I only had 11 to 12 order dice and other people had 15 to 16. It does make a difference. Okay, I'm not disagreeing with that. However, the difference between an inexperienced light mortar team and an inexperienced medium mortar team is 11 points. Can't take a spotter on either of those. The difference between those two is 11 points. And there aren't too many things you can do with 11 points to dramatically improve your order dice count. You're talking about a difference of plus or minus 1. So there's not a lot of real, well, 2, I guess, if you're using mule teams. But you get the point. Plus or minus 1, plus or minus 2. And the other things that you're adding in are kind of from a similar thought process. They also aren't going to do anything for you. And if it's a kill point mission, you really do have to hide those. But I think the bigger question comes down to, does the 10 to 20 points that you save actually matter? Right? Like, is it actually going to help you win a game? Yes, it may add 1 or 2 dice, but assuming that both players have somewhere around 15 dice in the pool, a difference of 1 or 2 is less than a 3% chance that your dice is going to be drawn. So the real question is, does a change of 1 or 2 actually impact the game? Or is it just part of an overall strategy? AKA, a person running a light mortar team shouldn't have 15 dice in the bag. They should have 30 dice in the bag. If that's the case, well, then, hey, fair enough. Fair point. I don't have a problem with that. But I think in general, one, the choice to pass up a medium mortar to take a light mortar because it's a cheaper order dice, I don't think it actually has much of an impact as people like to make it sound. And 2, and more than that, I think there are actually better and cheaper order dice options for you. The best example, and actually I'm going to, before moving on to the next one, maybe we'll talk through a couple of those. Probably the most obvious one is the anti-tank rifle team. Okay, the AT rifle team, purchased inexperienced, is only 21 points. It's only 30 points regular, so it's only slightly more, 5-6 points, difference of like 1 mule team over and against a light mortar team. And it is also a 2-man team. When purchased slightly more expensive, it is regular instead of inexperienced, so it's more likely to do what you want it to do. It's less likely to be wounded. It has a 36-inch range, which means it can outrange infantry. It has a solid range for reaching across the table as early as turn 1 to be able to shoot at people. It has the ability to reactive fire if it's being assaulted, which a light mortar team does not have. And if you're really trying to go for a large number of order dice, you can play Soviet Union, and you can take 3 of these as a single anti-tank option. Theater lists on top of that where you can take 3 anti-tank teams in a single platoon means you could potentially have 9 of these things, maybe a few less if you like dogmine teams and stuff like that, but you get the point. Like, you can take a ton of those, and most theater selectors are only going to let you take 1, maybe 2 light mortar teams. So if you're really looking for cost savings and cheap order dice, should you be leaning into the light mortar team or should you be leaning into the anti-tank rifle team? I think there's a fair question to be asked there. Okay. And so because of that, I just push back on the whole cheap order dice thing. I'm not entirely sure the light mortar team is the best way to do it, especially since it's a throwaway cheap order dice. It isn't actually going to contribute all that much. At best, it's cheerleading for you from the side. And maybe it has one great day. It's, the guy who suddenly comes in to be a replacement kicker and ends up kicking a field goal. And that's great. We love those. But in general, I just don't tend to find that to be a particularly convincing argument when there are better options available for you. Now, some are going to say, but Centaur, I use my light mortar teams to upgun transports. And I got to say, that's a fair point. Right? Because you have to send at least 1 guy, sometimes 2 guys, depending on how many guns you got to upgrade on this, maybe even 3, into a single transport. And hey, then you get machine guns or light machine guns coming out. That's great. And sometimes, throwing a 1-man dude in there isn't going to work. And you definitely don't want to throw a 5-man rifle squad in there. So maybe a light mortar team is a relatively cheap, good option. I think we should start by stepping back and asking a few questions on this one. The first is, how often does this actually happen? Because by far in second edition, the most common transport that had guns on it was a truck. And I don't personally have a problem with people running trucks. Look, sometimes it's law of necessity, okay? Partisans were using trucks all the time, okay? Because you just used what you had, right? From a gamesman perspective, I also just didn't really care. It was fine, whatever. Relatively easy to destroy, so I didn't really mind one way or another. But the critical thing is that upgun trucks, the crew mans the first gun, and it could only take one, unless you're doing weird, crazy SAS stuff. But then it was an armored car, at which point they can man as many as they have. So you're not actually going to use them there, and the result is you really only saw light mortar teams or anybody upgunning transports in one of two situations, and they were all tied to the Allies. The first was the Universal Bren Carrier, because it can take a light machine gun or an AT rifle down on the bottom section, and then it can also take a pintle-mounted 360-degree light machine gun. Quite useful. Most commonly, the crew would be manning the pintle-mounted light machine gun, because if you got a forward-facing light machine gun, pintle-mounted one, might as well fire the one that can fire everywhere. There's no reason not to. But that meant you needed somebody around to crew the second one. And so there's an argument for throwing a light mortar team into that one. One problem with this. Since the Bren carrier only has capacity for 5 people, if you're going to transport 2 light mortar team members in that transport, you're only having room for 3 more dudes, which is probably like a flamethrower team. And if you're one of those people who's running like a flamethrower team, a Piat team, maybe you want your officer up close to the front, but you don't want him getting shot to death by a random sniper, then maybe the transport needs a little more space. Or maybe you need to buy a second Bren carrier and maybe upgun that. And, a Bren carrier is like 60 points regular, 70 points with the pintle-mounted machine gun. So this is not a cheap buy, okay, in order to get that kind of capacity. But here we are spending points in order to try to make it work, right? I have questions on whether spending 94 points to get a Bren carrier with 2 shots is a worthwhile use of points, even if it comes with a second order dice from that light mortar team. I have serious questions on that. Most lists are not going to use this, but if that's the case, I think there are better options out there. I think if you're going to have to pay for an officer, you might as well throw an officer in there. You put him in there all by himself to man the gun, keep him in there pretty much all the time to use the gun. He's giving his morale to everybody that's in transport and the transport itself. That's good. And then you put a Piat team and a flamethrower team in the transport with him and Viola. Now you're cooking with grease. Spent 90 points on the 2 weapon teams that are in there. You spent 35 points on an inexperienced dude, 70 points on the transport, 200 points. You got 4 order dice, which is not horrible, that are all designed to go out there and get some. It can work. Okay. So I just don't know the light mortar team is all that necessary. If you're the Brits, you're also getting a free artillery observer. So if you want to run a second one, I guess I wonder whether maybe you don't use the artillery forward observer to call in a shot, then jump in a transport and man a gun for the rest of the game. Again, you take him free too, with no extra guys, just a 1-man drop. So, yeah, you can run a light mortar team. You can use it to upgun stuff. I just think there are maybe better options when you're talking about the Bren carrier. Okay. Now, the M3 half-track and the M3 scout car are a separate deal entirely. Those ones you can take multiple machine guns that can fire. And most people are going to take 2. They're going to take the ones that fire left, fire right, not necessarily taking ones that fire to the rear, because if you've got things firing to the front, things firing to the rear, you pretty much just got problems when you're talking about a open-topped, relatively unarmored, armored transport. In this case, yeah, you can use a 24-point light mortar team. Same time, when you factor in the cost of the transport, probably purchased regular, so that way you're not inflicting that -1 to hit with all those machine guns. Paying an extra 15 points per machine gun for an extra 30 points worth of machine guns, plus a 24-point light mortar team. That's like 150 points just to get a transport with some extra machine gun shots that's completely open-topped. You can do it. It's a total strategy. There's not a problem there. It still has room, especially in the case of the M3 half-track, to fit, a nice big infantry section. So, it's not like it doesn't do anything for you. I'm just saying, I don't know that I would spend my points that way. I would spend those points on 2 more infantry sections with Browning automatic rifles, personally. But again, you do as you like. different strategies, different ways to think about it. I don't personally find upgunning transports as a good reason to take a light mortar team. Objective camping. Now, this is probably actually the reason why most people take light mortar teams. Okay. They have the benefit of automatically being a small team, assuming you're taking, again, two-man team. And if they go down every turn, that's another -2 to hit, which means your starting difficulty to hit, assuming you're not at point blank range, is 6s. Pins, moving and shooting, anything like that is 6s by 6s, which is really good. Couple of problems. Number one, the unit is still extremely fragile. If you're trying to save points and you're taking it inexperienced, 3+ to wound is not great. So if anything does sneak through, if your opponent is rolling really well, or if they're just rolling really high volumes of fire, right? If you're getting 20+ shots at you from an enemy, that could be problematic because a decent number of 6s may come up, and then even if one sneaks through, 3+ to wound removes one guy, forces a morale test, could be the end of it, right? So from a math perspective, yes, it helps on the front end, but there's no cushion on the back end, assuming again that you're going for a cheap unit. Second issue is it's great for objective camping if no one tries to assault you. Because if they do come in on assault and go into close combat, you can't reactive fire. There's no way for you to shoot back at them. Okay. The other issue is how often objective camping actually comes up. So in the 12 scenarios that are in the main rulebook, obviously if you're using any of the other allied packs or, the Juggernaut pack or anybody else like that makes stuff over here at Zern, we have our own Zern mission pack that we've created for 3rd edition, but you can totally use it for 2nd edition as well. Only 25%, 3 out of 12 of the scenarios from the rulebook have objectives that are easily camped by a light mortar team. There are technically others that involve objectives, but if you're trying to capture a dossier and bring it back to your side, it's a moving objective. So how do you camp that, right? You can't technically camp it. Now, to be fair, when we're looking at these stats on 25%, 3 out of 12 scenarios, one of those, admittedly, is key positions, which is probably the most commonly used scenario in all of Bolt Action. For a lot of good reasons. It's very well played. It's a very, very good scenario. It rewards maneuver warfare. It's a good one to include, especially if you're doing just like a, 1 day, three round tournament. Key positions is going to come up quite a bit. So you might see this 25% slightly overrepresented, but at the same time, you'll also see other scenarios overly represented, like sectors, for example, or any of the ones that are just kill count missions. Typically, you'll find one of those thrown in just so that people can't just camp in the back. Where this fragile unit could very easily be a liability. There's nothing for it to camp. It isn't actually contributing that towards your roll, but it is a relatively easy order dice to remove, especially for an assault heavy army, a flamethrower army, or anything else like that. This means there are questions about taking the unit specifically for the purpose of camping. I'm not sure how useful it actually is toward that role. And again, anything that this unit does for camping objectives, the anti-tank rifle team does better. It can reactive fire. It can provide pins downrange dramatically more easily. It tends to hit more often. And for a few points more, it is dramatically more resilient and more likely to do what you want. For a few points less, it is probably just as effective, to be completely honest, right? So from a comparison point, if you're taking it for objective camping, I just have questions about why you would take a light mortar team over against an anti-tank rifle team. I also have questions on if you got to camp an objective, why you'd put a light mortar team on it instead of a medium mortar team on it. Because I do feel like the medium mortar team is going to be better for objective camping because not only can they camp your objective for you, they can much more readily and much more effectively threaten another objective. So again, it is a reason. I just don't personally agree with it. And the final thing we're going to look at here, as we're starting to wrap up 2nd edition, we get ready to look at 3rd edition, because I know this has rambled on for quite a bit, is the opportunity cost. So the first question when it comes to opportunity cost is the slot. In the vast majority of theater lists, and then of course the generic reinforced platoon, the light, medium, and heavy mortar all take up the same slot. So by taking a light mortar team, you've chosen not to take a medium or heavy mortar team. And we've already talked about the light mortar by comparison to the medium mortar, right? Their ability to do counter battery fire is dramatically more limited, so you can't do as many rolls as a medium mortar team can, even more so compared to a heavy mortar, which can also take a spotter, has even longer range, does even more damage, for not that much more. Admittedly, it is close to double the cost of a comparable light mortar team, but you're also getting double or triple the effect of what you're getting out of that. And the actual total difference is going to be a difference of 20 points, probably less than one unit, maybe one or two, but those are going to be throwaway units that are just cheerleading from the side. The fact that you get a reduced squad size with light mortars is also potentially an issue because, again, you're easier to remove. If you were able to take multiple light mortars, you know, if they all came with the extra selection special rule that you'll see sometimes on different units, that'd be one thing. But because you can't, there's just legitimate questions on how much you're actually effectively doing. And the fact that a medium or heavy mortar is constantly doing on average 2 pins per turn instead of a 50-50 chance at doing 2 pins per turn is, I think, a good reason from a pin perspective to say we're leaving a lot on the table by choosing to take a light mortar over and against a medium or heavy mortar. Okay, so personally, when I'm sitting down making a list, if I only have like 25, 30 points left and I'm looking at still taking a mortar, I've typically taken a mortar by the time I get down to my last 20 or 30 points. But if I am, I'm probably going to go up and I'm going to remove some gear and I'm going to take a medium or heavy mortar over and against a light mortar. Just because I think from an opportunity cost, I'm leaving a lot on the table that I really shouldn't be by choosing not to take those. And this kind of transitions us into third edition. Third edition did make some very positive changes that make the light mortar a little more usable, which I really like. The first is it fixes the slot problem, right? So you can still take a light, medium, or heavy mortar in the slots of a heavy weapons platoon. You can potentially take up to 5 of those, 2 for the minimum required that you have to take when you take a heavy weapons platoon, because you have to take mortars or machine guns. But then you could take an extra 3 mortars on top of that. So you could potentially take 2 light mortars plus another 3, which is 5. Or you could take medium or heavy mortars in your heavy weapons platoon, and then in your rifle platoon, you can take 2 more light mortar teams. So now the light mortars aren't fighting with the medium and heavy mortars for their spots. The opportunity cost thing, it still technically exists because light mortars aren't free. So you're still spending points on it by taking points in one place. You aren't taking points in another place. But it removes some of that tension, which I think is good. The second thing that it does is that they increase the maximum range to 36 inches, not 24, which is good because, again, it's more than a rifle. So it's not necessarily a free roll for your opponent. It's not free intel for your opponent, at least not nearly as much. And technically, again, asterisk, it's kind of 42 inches when you factor in the advance because they still don't have the fixed property. So you can still move and shoot. And this is a big change, because the rules for spotters changed and any unit can use any other unit spotter as long as they're not inexperienced and they're not a multiple rocket launcher. You can now borrow spotters from a medium mortar, heavy mortar, medium artillery, heavy artillery, light artillery if you're a British 25-pounder. You can still borrow all of those, which is really great. So all of these, I think, are very positive. And if these were the only changes that applied to light mortars, I mean, I think they'd at least be worth trying. I would say if you're going to buy a support team so you can get a second medium mortar to run in something, you might as well run the light mortar that probably comes in that same set. If you're buying a set of infantry and you have a couple of extra bodies lying around on the sprue, check to see if they have a light mortar and just build a light mortar team. Just to see, right? You know, what you think about it. Because again, you've got the tools lying around, might as well give it a try. The problem is there have also been some changes. Okay, the first and most obvious is that it is easier to hit units. It is now easier to wound units, and it is easier to pin units because they took a bunch of those modifiers out and they turned some of them into cover saves. So now being a 2-man team and a 3-man team doesn't make a 2-man team harder to hit. Small team is gone. Doesn't exist anymore. So now the 2-man light mortar team and the 3-man medium mortar team have the same difficulty of being hit. If you're wounded still on a 3+, because that part didn't change, it means there's a lot more potential hits coming through. And because hitting is now easier to do, pins in general are going to stack up. So running inexperienced light mortar teams means that You're less likely to do what you want to do with it unless your plan was just to go down every single turn. You're more likely to be wounded, and that means you have to roll more saves to try to stop the wound from happening. Now, somebody's going to say to me, well, we get benefit of cover saves, and you're more likely to get a cover save because you only have to have half of your two bodies protected by cover. That's kind of true. Personally, having played a lot of games that have cover saves or fate saves or armor saves or things like that, I'm just going to tell you right now, a 5+ save, 4+ save, heck, even a 3+ save, that's a lot of margin for error, especially if somebody's rolling 4 or 5 hits and gets 3 or 4 wounds against you because they're wounding on a 3+. So, I think it kind of balances out some of the benefits. I'm not saying that on its own makes it so these are completely untakeable. I think what does change it is that the 24-point light mortar, while it did get cheaper, the 21-point formerly inexperienced anti-tank rifle team is now only 18 points. And a regular light mortar team, even though it's 30 points, the regular anti-tank rifle team is 25 points. And now that there's no long range hit penalty and it's most likely hitting on 4s, maybe 5s, AT rifle teams got better. So again, if we were already in the question of do we run light mortars, do we run anti-tank rifles, I think there's a legitimate question of why would I spend roughly 100 points to get 3 regular light mortar teams and then a 10-point spotter on somebody else when I can take 4 anti-tank rifle teams that are going to be more reliable at taking out transports, more reliable at putting pins on target, more reliable about doing wounds on target, and potentially might be more survivable taking regular as opposed to inexperienced. I don't know. There's just some questions, right? That need to be asked. I just have so many questions. I have so many questions on that one. Yes, you can run potentially, 7 light mortars in a rifle and heavy weapons platoon. If you're playing Soviets, you can run 12 anti-tank rifles in that same platoon setup, right? So there's just a lot of questions that I have on whether the math, even though the cost of light mortars has gone down, in terms of squad-based weapons, because the AT rifle team went down too, I have questions on that. Medium mortar teams are now more resilient as well because they're just as easy to hit now. They have more wounds. You're probably still taking them with a spotter. You're probably still hiding them and keeping them safe, except that now you don't have to take something else that has a spotter in order to get the benefits of the spotter. You can take the spotter on the mortar itself. So, I think there's that. There's also a weird thing about the cost to upgrade. So now, because of the fact that you start with light mortars and you add to the cost, we have a static cost for how much it costs from one level to another, which, complete aside, I appreciate. The whole 14 to 16 points off thing, I don't know, I always had some issues with that. But now it's 15 points to get an extra man, which is anywhere from 7 to 13 points, and the benefits of the weapon. So the weapon itself is only costing you like 5 points, 8 points to take, which is not that much considering the range difference, the damage difference, the pin generation is actually the same now. So that's not that different anymore. But still, I think for value, I'm still thinking from what I'm getting on the table, the medium mortar is probably worth the extra points, right? Heavy mortar probably also still worth the points, but you kind of get the point there. I don't see that there. Also, by virtue of how the rolling for mission setup and scenarios works, there's less objective missions, ironically, now, where you can just camp an objective with somebody. Again, I still feel like they're probably going to re-roll out these before tournaments happen, before they release the pack, probably because as a tournament organizer who's organized tournaments before for other games, I don't want to roll on the day of and then hope that the board setups all work for, things being placed in the middle or deployment zones being wonky or weird or whatever. I don't want to deal with that. That's just too hard for me. I don't like it. But the result is, I think on balance, we're going to see less objective missions. There's going to be less opportunities to camp stuff. Now, if you're working with the Zern mission pack, not necessarily true. Zern mission pack is slightly above average because we did weight objectives a little more than we did other stuff. But if they're not using the Zern mission pack, I think in general, you're going to see less objective missions. So camping objectives, not quite as useful as it was in second edition. And then if you can believe it, The cost of light mortar squad weapons went up. They went up to 35 points each instead of 25 points. Now, part of this is because they can use spotters, and I get it. Like that's fine. But again, like it's not like the actual weapon profile changed all that much, right? It's still getting the +1 to wound. It's still only affecting probably 2 bodies a turn. Like it's not making a dramatic difference. But they increased the cost of them by 35 points. That means if you want all 3 light mortars in a Japanese or Belgian grenadier section, you gotta pay 105 points plus the 60 points worth of dudes, assuming it's regular, to man the things. Like 165 points. I could get a lot of stuff for 165 points. You know, like there's just a lot there. I could buy a spotter on a completely different weapon and take a Horo assault gun, which is a heavy howitzer now with the benefit of a spotter. Right? So like there's a lot that you can do for the same cost as 6 dudes carrying around 3 light mortars. There's a lot there. Now, to be fair, the VB launcher did not go up in cost. It also didn't really change in terms of weapon profile. It stayed the same. So I guess by comparison to light mortars, a VB launcher, not bad. I still wouldn't take it. I think 20 points, you're still better off just taking 2 more dudes with rifles, right? Or something like that. Or paying 18 points to take an AT rifle team, personally. But still, I think there's at least something there. Maybe play around VB launchers if you already have them modeled up. There's no reason not to. We now, on the American rifle sprue, the new winter airborne sprue, we get like a grenade launcher. You could probably proxy that in on a French guy and say, hey, this is a VB launcher, or, use it for a free French guy or something like that. And something like that. We'll see what ends up happening with how free French work. But the point at least is maybe there's something there. I'm probably not going to dabble with it all that much, but if you want to, feel free. But here's the deal. At the end of the day, if you like them, by all means, run them. Okay. From an optimization standpoint, I don't personally think they're worth it, but there are optimizers out there who disagree with me. Bo Mortensen is currently kicking around with them. He plays at the highest level of competition. He's a very good player, and he thinks they have uses. So, you're not wrong by liking them. That's fine. I just personally don't like them. I think that there's other things I'd rather spend my points on. But if you're going to run them in 2nd or 3rd edition, 4 things I would recommend from you. First is you need to use it as a harassing unit. Should probably be located somewhere around the edges, around the flanks, where it can get away from things, stay away from things. You don't really want it brawling with more than 1 unit at a time. And in general, you want to use a +1 unit mentality. So if I'm going to use my light mortar to take on an enemy unit, let's say, for example, I want to fire at a sniper team. Not generally a good idea in 2nd edition, because if the sniper shoots back at you because you got to fire direct, things could be over very fast, okay? But the point is, if you're going to try to use it to take on a sniper team, you can actually, and you can do it quite effectively. You just have to make sure that you're also running like, an engineer section with a flamethrower, or maybe also a flamethrower team. Possibly also, I don't know, like some sort of officer that's giving a necessary morale bonus or something like that. Also in the same area, so that the sniper is looking and being like, okay, target saturation, similar to the battle board we looked at earlier. What's the sniper going to prioritize? Am I going to prioritize the little piddly light mortar team that maybe hits me, but probably doesn't? No, probably not. It's going to take a couple turns for it to range in. I can wait on that one, is what most players playing a sniper team are going to say. They're going to look and they're going to say, it would be really swell, especially considering this is a, call it veteran assault engineers, Soviet flamethrower, embedded in a squad. I got to start throwing hits on that thing now, because I'm not going to be able to get too many shots on it before it gets into where it needs to go. Wounding on a 5, not that easy to do. If they took the body armor on it, wounding on a 6. That means that sniper's got to probably start working on it first thing. Which means the light mortar has some time to start working on the sniper team and maybe even get a little lucky. And then eventually, maybe the sniper turns and tries to shoot at them. But from experience, snipers don't always hit. Sometimes they get a 1, sometimes they get a 2. Sometimes you're just buying enough time for your, light autocannon mounted vehicle to pop around a corner, shoot some HE shots over at that sniper, ignore all the cover that he's getting. Sure, take the small team penalty, who cares? And just light that guy up like a Christmas tree in the hopes that you at least remove the extra guy on it so that he's less likely to do his job, if not remove the squad entirely. Maybe that's all the light mortar needs to be there to do. Okay, it can take on units, but it can take them on in a +1 unit mentality. It's an add-on to something else. Relatively expensive add-on, but that is how you would probably want to use it. Now, in third edition, you get the benefit that you can actually do counter battery fire with some level of reliability with this thing, both because you can use spotters and because you actually have a range that can reach a reasonable distance across the table. Your primary target is going to be artillery, also stuff that you'll find in heavy weapons platoons, machine gun teams, other mortar teams, even anti-tank teams are decent things to shoot at because they would personally prefer to be standing still and shooting. They don't want to suffer the -1 to hit penalty because then they're probably looking at 5s to hit and nobody wants to fire 1 dice on 5s. Okay. The result is they might sit there and wait for you. Okay. In third edition, if you're trying to get guys out of, say, buildings or other stuff where you want to be able to ignore cover saves and things like that, and thus the indirect fire from a light mortar is useful, you might actually lean into the skid and go with a shape charge anti-tank team instead. Bazookas and Piats might actually work better. But at the same time, I don't know, like you can take a lot of light mortars, so maybe that's worthwhile. Okay. Again, you can also take advantage a little bit of economy of scale because of the fact that you get so many slots for taking light mortars. So you can really take advantage of their lower cost. But I think the big thing again that you're trying to use with this is you're trying to dissuade camping. And that could be camping objectives. But even if there's no objectives in the match, you're still keeping people from just sitting in a building waiting for people to come in and taking advantage of all that beautiful cover against small arms fire. You're keeping people from just sitting in a forest. You're keeping people from hiding out behind a stone wall next to or not next to an objective. You're keeping the enemy heavy weapon from ranging in on you or somebody else that you really care about. Right? There are a lot of different ways that you can dissuade your opponent from staying in one area, forcing them to move around. And when you force them to move around, you're in control of the tempo and they are reduced in their ability to shoot. Both of which maybe is worth a 21 to 30 point light mortar team. So what would be my fixes? I'm going to recommend 3 potential fixes, but I wouldn't recommend you use all of them. The first is that I would allow them to fire direct. Okay. You reduce their minimum and their maximum range by 6 inches in second edition. I would reduce it by even more than that for their maximum range in third edition. And the reason why I'm recommending this is because, one, it means they can reactive fire now against people who want to charge them off of an objective. So it fixes that category. I don't think it's a good thing if you're firing direct in that situation. It means you're probably in a lot of trouble still because, again, you're only going to wipe out 1, maybe 2 dudes. So you're probably not in good shape, but it's something. So there's that. But the second reason why I recommend this is that it was done historically. There are examples and stories of people shoulder mounting a 60mm mortar and just firing it like a bazooka because it is effectively just a grenade launcher. That's all it is. It's just a grenade launcher. So I would allow you to direct fire it. I don't have a problem with that. It makes it slightly more usable. It's extremely short range. No problems here. The second thing that I would recommend doing is I think we need to reduce the cost of light mortars in squads to 15 points each. And I say 15 because in a meta where that's roughly around the same cost as a light machine gun, it's also the same cost that you're paying for a regular light mortar in a light mortar team. Again, I feel like if the team weapon and the squad weapon cost the same, I like that a lot. It also means that by taking 1, you're only passing up on 1 and a smidge of another guy, depending on where you're taking it in for that squad-based weapon. So you're not losing that many bodies, whereas 25 points a pop really begins to add up. Okay, so I think that would probably make it a little more appealing. We would see it used a little more. And again, by virtue of what we talked about with the difficulties to hit and difficulty to wound, I don't see it changing that much of the math, right? In terms of how many people are actually removed, or how many pins are actually generated. It's not going to change all that much. It would just lead to another more legitimate way to play Japanese in second edition than, say, Bamboo Spear Fighters. And in third edition, it would just kind of underscore, hey, here's another way to be able to play this game, right? Because again, we're a little too early on to say what the quote-unquote meta is with Japan. An alternative to reducing the cost, if you don't want to play around or monkey around with costs because you feel like, well, maybe it's a little too cheap, it might become too good. An alternative is whenever it misses on a turn where it's firing, it can re-roll a failed hit. Now, it doesn't range in immediately. So if you're looking for sixes, your re-roll would be sixes. But then on the next turn, if you're rolling for fives, if you fail to hit, you could re-roll for fives. This is designed to reflect the fact that, one, the rate of fire on a 60 millimeter mortar is dramatically faster than on an 81 or higher millimeter mortar. Okay. This has to do with the size of the tube. It has to do with the size of the ammunition. It has to do with the weight of the ammunition. It is dramatically faster to fire a light mortar than it is to fire anything larger than that. So I'd say if they're going to have trouble ranging in, and if they're going to be moving and scooting, and they're going to be hitting on sixes, maybe fives most of the time anyway, heck, give them a reroll. It's not going to change that much, to be honest, about the math. The math doesn't go up very much on a rerollable six. It doesn't even go up that much on a rerollable five. So because of that, I don't personally have a problem with it. I think it's great. You might see in a battery of 3 of them firing out of a single squad, one of them might hit on a given turn. Maybe. And that assumes a lot of things about the math for how you calculate that. Okay, it's not going to dramatically change it, but it does give you a good reason to run it. Okay, so those are changes I would make. But you know what? Even if you don't accept any changes, if you're not monkeying around with anything, look, if you like light mortars, run light mortars. And then find a way to use them that makes them effective. I don't personally think that they're very optimized, but they could be fun. And a skirmish is chaos, which means there could arise situations where a light mortar becomes useful on the battlefield. I don't think they're quite as common as some people would like you to believe they are, but I think they can definitely arrive. So definitely play around with it. My recommendation, though, is if you do like light mortars and if you do want to use them and you do want them to work for you, you probably do need to lean into the skid. You probably do need to take more than one of them. So just keep that in mind. Maybe even use them together in pairs, right? They're both working on the same unit. They're both trying at the same time. So that way, if one hits, maybe it creates enough of enough pins that it causes the other unit to go down. So that way it makes it easier for the other one to jump in and help out. And then the two of them are kicking somebody together. Maybe that works. I don't know. But feel free to give it a try. Again, this is not per se an optimization channel. Here to have fun. I do think optimization can sometimes help you to have some fun because it can keep you from being just casually rolled by your friends in a casual game. It can keep you from wasting your money when you go and pay to go to a tournament. But at the same time, like I think if you like it, you should run what you like. And you're going to find a lot on this channel. I'm going to recommend you use stuff that other people are going to say, that's a bad idea. From an optimization standpoint, that's a bad idea. These are things I enjoy. Okay. My shelves are full of miniatures that other people don't like. Okay. But I do. I don't happen to collect any light mortars. You might have a ton of them lying around. That's great. So if you like them, go ahead and use them. Find a way to make them win. And the beauty about being in the new edition, in 3rd edition, is not only is it possible for you to use a lot of what you like, as much as people like to hate on spamming things, I grew up in Hawaii. I grew up on spam. I don't have a horrible thought about spam, whether it comes to food or games. To be completely honest, spam is fine with me. People made decisions. They made opportunity costs in order to get whatever it is they spammed out. Okay. In warfare, people have spammed a lot of things. If you want to spam out light mortars because you just like them, go ahead and try it and just see what happens. We're early enough on that nobody can really say it's a good or a bad choice. I think mathematically and theoretically, there are certain issues that can crop up, but a lot of those issues, who knows, maybe you'll be able to work around. Maybe your tables will look differently from the ones that I see. I don't know. There's a lot of things to think about. So feel free to try them out. If you've had good experiences with them, great. Share them down below in the comments. Also keep in mind, there's the thing called survivor's bias, which is where we tend to think of things by virtue of the games we remember, most notably when bad things happen to us or good things happen for us. So just remember that, results will vary, but maybe we will find a pattern. Maybe we will find a trend, and who knows, maybe the World Tournament of Champions or, another massive event that goes on, maybe we will see light mortars carrying things. We will see. And then maybe I'll do a response video talking about, was I wrong about light mortars? No, I don't know. We'll see. I don't know if I'm that YouTube channel, so I guess we'll find out later. But I hope that you've enjoyed this, just listening to a relatively newer player rant about the game. I have very, very much enjoyed getting to hang with you all, and so we will see you next time.